I was serving champagne at my husband's company anniversary party when his secretary stood up, placed her hand on her rounded belly, and announced she was carrying his child. The room went silent. Every face turned to look at me, the wife who apparently was the last to know. I didn't drop the champagne bottle. I didn't scream. I didn't even flinch. I simply smiled, set the bottle down on the marble countertop, and said, "Congratulations, Amanda. I'm sure you'll make wonderful parents." Then I excused myself to the powder room, where I spent exactly 3 minutes staring at my reflection, watching 47 years of marriage crumble behind my eyes. But that night wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the most powerful chapter I'd ever written. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The woman staring back at me in that gilded bathroom mirror wasn't the same person who had walked into the Riverside Country Club 3 hours earlier. That woman had been Catherine Elena Morrison, devoted wife to tech mogul David Morrison, gracious hostess, and silent partner in a 30-year empire built on innovation and ambition. The woman in the mirror was someone I was just beginning to meet. My name is Catherine, but everyone calls me Cat. At 68, I suppose I should have seen this coming. Maybe I did see it and chose to paint over the cracks with dinner parties and charity galas and the comfortable routine of a marriage that had long since settled into something more like a business partnership than a love affair. David was 72, still handsome in that silver-haired, distinguished way that made women at cocktail parties lean in when he spoke about market trends and technological disruption. His company, Morrison Tech Solutions, had grown from a small software consulting firm into a multi-million-dollar corporation with offices in 12 states. I had been there from the beginning, back when we operated out of the spare bedroom of our first apartment in downtown Phoenix. I answered phones, organized his files, balanced the books, and made coffee for potential clients who came to meetings in our cramped living room. I had a business degree from Arizona State, but David always said my real talent was making people feel comfortable, creating the kind of atmosphere where deals could flourish. So I became the hostess, the wife who remembered everyone's children's names and sent handwritten thank you notes and organized company retreats that felt more like family gatherings. Amanda Stevenson had been David's executive assistant for 3 years. She was 28, blonde, efficient, and had the kind of polished professionalism that made her indispensable in client meetings. She wore tailored blazers and carried leather portfolios and spoke in the crisp, confident tone of someone who had studied business communication. I had hired her myself after interviewing 6 candidates. She had the best credentials, the most relevant experience, and when she spoke about her 5-year career goals, I was impressed by her ambition and clarity. I should have trusted my first instinct. There had been something in the way she looked at David during that interview, a flicker of interest that went beyond professional curiosity. But I dismissed it as nerves or enthusiasm for the position. David was old enough to be her father, after all. Surely she was simply eager to work for someone with his reputation and success. The company anniversary party was held every October at the Riverside Country Club, the same venue where David and I had celebrated our silver wedding anniversary 5 years earlier. It was our tradition to honor the employees who had been with us the longest, to recognize outstanding achievements, and to announce the next year's expansion plans. This year marked Morrison Tech's 20th anniversary as an incorporated business, though David and I both knew the real anniversary was 27 years ago, when we first hung out our shingle in that tiny apartment. I had spent weeks planning the event. I chose the menu, arranged the flowers, coordinated with the photographer, and personally wrote the invitation copy. The theme was Building Tomorrow, and I had commissioned a photo timeline of the company's growth that stretched along one entire wall of the ballroom. There were pictures of David and me in our early 30s, exhausted but exhilarated after landing our first major contract. Photos of our first real office, a modest space in a strip mall where David insisted on keeping a coffee pot that produced The worst coffee in Phoenix, but somehow became a company legend. Images of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, award presentations, client celebrations, and the faces of employees who had become like family over the years. I wore a navy blue dress that evening, silk with subtle beading along the neckline, paired with the pearl earrings David had given me for our 20th anniversary. My hair was styled in the elegant updo I always chose for formal events, and I carried the small beaded clutch that matched my shoes. I felt confident, prepared, excited to celebrate another milestone in the journey David and I had traveled together. The party began at 6 o'clock with cocktails on the terrace overlooking the golf course. The October evening was perfect, warm but not humid, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of the club's famous rose garden. I moved through the crowd, like I always did at these events, greeting employees and their spouses, asking about children and vacation plans, making sure everyone felt welcomed and appreciated. David worked the room from the other direction, his natural charisma drawing clusters of people who hung on his words about industry trends and market projections. Amanda arrived fashionably late, just as we were moving inside for dinner. She wore a black cocktail dress that I didn't recognize, something new and more expensive than her usual professional attire. The dress was well cut, but couldn't quite disguise the gentle swell of her belly, which I noticed immediately but assumed was simply the result of too many business lunches, or perhaps a recent vacation indulgence. She moved differently that night, with a kind of deliberate grace that seemed almost ceremonial. During dinner, I sat at the head table between David and Robert Chen, our chief technology officer who had been with us for 15 years. The conversation flowed easily around topics I could navigate in my sleep: upcoming projects, industry, conferences, the challenges of scaling a business while maintaining company culture. I noticed that Amanda was seated at a table near the front, close enough to the head table that she could easily make eye contact with David. Throughout the meal, I caught them exchanging glances and small smiles that seemed to carry some private understanding. The formal program began after the main course. David stood to welcome everyone and deliver his annual State of the Company address. He spoke about the challenges and triumphs of the past year, thanked key employees by name, and outlined his vision for continued growth. His speech was polished and inspiring, filled with the kind of leadership rhetoric that had made him a sought-after speaker at industry conferences. I had heard variations of this speech dozens of times, but I still felt proud watching him command the room with his presence and passion. After David's remarks, we moved into the recognition portion of the evening. We presented service awards to long-term employees, acknowledged exceptional project contributions, and announced promotions that had been kept secret for weeks. The mood was celebratory and warm, exactly the atmosphere I had hoped to create. People laughed at David's gentle jokes about the early days when we couldn't afford proper office furniture and conducted meetings around a folding table from Walmart. Then came the announcement portion of the evening, typically reserved for upcoming projects or new hires. David had mentioned that a few employees wanted to share personal news, which wasn't unusual. Over the years, we had celebrated engagements, births, graduations, and other milestones that marked the passage of time in our extended work family. Amanda rose from her seat with the kind of confident poise that suggested she had rehearsed this moment. She smoothed her dress and walked to the front of the room, accepting the microphone from David with a smile that seemed to contain secrets. The room quieted with the polite attention that such moments commanded. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate 20 amazing years of Morrison Tech, she began, her voice clear and steady. This company has become my professional home, and David has been an incredible mentor and leader. She paused, her hand moving to rest on her belly in a gesture that suddenly seemed significant rather than casual, which makes tonight's announcement even more special for me. The silence in the room shifted from polite attention to focused anticipation. I felt a strange flutter in my stomach. an intuition that something was about to change in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. I'm thrilled to share that David and I are expecting our first child together this spring. Amanda's smile was radiant, triumphant, and completely unapologetic. We wanted to share this news with our work family first, because you've all been such an important part of our journey. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. I heard them clearly, but couldn't quite process their meaning immediately. David and I are expecting our first child, our work family. Each phrase landed with increasing weight until the full impact crashed over me like a wave I hadn't seen coming. The room erupted in a confusion of gasps, murmurs, and nervous laughter. Some people began clapping uncertainly, unsure whether congratulations were appropriate given the obvious complication of David's existing marriage. Others sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Amanda, David, and me as they tried to understand what exactly was happening. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, waiting for my reaction, my explosion, my breakdown. They expected tears or anger or some dramatic response that would match the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Instead, I felt something unexpected settle over me like a familiar coat. Clarity. I stood slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. I walked to where Amanda stood holding the microphone, my heels clicking against the polished floor in a rhythm that seemed unnaturally loud in the expectant silence. When I reached her, I gently took the microphone from her hands. "Congratulations, Amanda," I said, my voice carrying clearly throughout the ballroom. "I'm sure you and David will make wonderful parents." I handed the microphone back to her and turned to face the room full of shocked faces. "If you'll excuse me, I think I need a moment to process this lovely surprise." I walked toward the ladies' room with the same measured pace, neither hurrying nor dragging my feet. Behind me, I could hear the nervous buzz of conversations starting. Up, David's voice attempting to regain control of the situation, and the general discomfort of a room full of people who had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. In the bathroom, I stood before the mirror and looked at myself with new eyes. The woman reflected back at me was impeccably dressed, perfectly composed, and completely betrayed. But she was also something else, something I was just beginning to recognize. She was free. I had spent 30 years building David's dream, supporting his vision, creating the foundation that allowed him to soar. I had subordinated my own ambitions to his, convinced myself that his success was our success, that his happiness was sufficient for both of us. I had been the perfect corporate wife, the gracious hostess, the silent partner who made everything possible but received little recognition for her contributions. But in that moment, staring at my reflection in the country club's ornate mirror, I realized that I had been playing a game with rules I had never agreed to. David had changed those rules without consulting me, had rewritten our contract without my signature, had decided that our partnership was no longer exclusive without bothering to inform me. The betrayal stung, of course. 27 years of marriage, of shared dreams and mutual sacrifice, reduced to a public announcement at a company party. The humiliation was complete and deliberate, designed to establish Amanda's claim while minimizing my importance. But underneath the hurt and anger, I felt something else stirring, something that felt remarkably like opportunity. I pulled my phone from my clutch and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Victoria Hamilton, my college roommate who had become one of Phoenix's most successful attorneys. We had maintained our friendship over the decades, sharing holiday cards and occasional lunches, but I had never imagined I would need her professional services. "Victoria," I said when she answered, "it's Kat Morrison. I hope I'm not calling too late, but I find myself in need of a very good lawyer." "Kat? Is everything all right? You sound strange." "Everything is about to change," I said, watching my reflection straighten its shoulders. "And I want to make sure it changes in my favor." When I returned to the ballroom 15 minutes later, the party had taken on a subdued, awkward energy. People clustered in small groups, speaking in low voices and glancing nervously toward the head table where David sat alone, Amanda having apparently retreated after her announcement. I could see him scanning the room, looking for me with an expression that combined guilt, anxiety, and something that might have been relief at having his secret finally revealed. I walked directly to him, my steps sure and purposeful. When I reached the table, I leaned down and spoke quietly in his ear, my voice calm and controlled. "We need to talk," I said. "But not here, and not tonight. Tomorrow morning, my office, 9 o'clock sharp." He started to respond, but I was already walking away, making my rounds to thank people for coming and wish them a good evening. I played the gracious hostess one last time, accepting their awkward condolences and confused well wishes with the same poise I had maintained all evening. No one quite knew what to say, but everyone seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted in ways that couldn't be undone. I left the party alone, driving home through the quiet Phoenix streets in my silver Mercedes sedan, the radio playing softly as I processed the events of the evening. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, as if the very walls had absorbed the knowledge of David's betrayal and reflected it back in the familiar shadows and spaces we had shared for so many years. I poured myself a glass of wine, a good Pinot Grigio that David and I had bought during a trip to Sonoma 5 years earlier, back when we still traveled together and shared the same bed and talked about growing old gracefully side by side. I sat in the living room surrounded by the photographs and mementos of our life together. But instead of feeling nostalgic or sad, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt angry. Not the hot, destructive anger that burns out quickly, but the cold, focused anger that sharpens the mind and clarifies purpose. David came home around midnight, his key turning in the lock with the same familiar sound that had marked the end of countless evenings over the decades. I heard him pause in the entryway, probably listening for signs of my presence, trying to gauge my mood before venturing further into the house. I remained in the living room, wine glass in hand, waiting. "Cat?" he called softly. "Are you awake?" "In here," I replied, my voice neutral. He appeared in the doorway, his tuxedo jacket draped over his arm, his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. He looked older than his 72 years in that moment, worn down by whatever emotional toll the evening had taken on him. His expression was cautious, almost fearful, like a child who knows he's about to be punished but isn't sure how severe the consequences will be. "I know you must have questions," he began, settling into the chair across from me with obvious reluctance. "I do," I said, setting down my wine glass. "But they can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, I just want you to know that I heard Amanda's announcement clearly. I understand its implications fully, and I'm not going to make this easy for you." He flinched at the word easy as if I had struck him. "Kat, please, let me explain. It's complicated, and it's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," I said, standing and smoothing my dress. "You've been having an affair with your secretary, she's pregnant with your child, and you decided the appropriate way to inform me was to let her make a public announcement at our company party in front of everyone we know and work with." "I didn't know she was going to do that," he said quickly. "I told her we needed to discuss how to handle telling you, but she took matters into her own hands." "How long?" I asked, the question hanging between us like a challenge. He was quiet, for a long moment, his hands fidgeting with his bow tie. 8 months, he finally admitted. 8 months, I repeated, letting the timeline settle over me. "So this started right around the time you insisted we needed to update our wills and estate planning. How thoughtful of you to think ahead." His face went pale. "That's not why I suggested the estate planning, isn't it?" I moved toward the stairs, then paused and turned back to face him. "David, in 30 years of marriage, you have never lied to me about anything important. Don't start now. It will only make things worse for both of us." I left him sitting, in the living room and went upstairs to our bedroom, where I changed into comfortable clothes and began the process of packing a suitcase. I wasn't leaving permanently, but I needed space to think, to plan, to figure out how to navigate the minefield that my life had suddenly become. As I folded clothes into the suitcase, I thought about the woman I had been 8 hours earlier. That woman had trusted completely, had believed in the partnership she thought she was part of, had never imagined that her husband could betray her so completely. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and far more dangerous than David could possibly realize. I had spent 30 years learning every detail of Morrison Tech's operations, understanding every contract and relationship and vulnerability. I knew where the money flowed, which clients were most valuable, which employees were truly indispensable. I had been the company's unofficial chief operating officer without the title or recognition, the person who actually made things run while David provided the vision and charisma. Tomorrow, that knowledge would become my weapon. Tonight, it was simply the foundation upon which I would build my revenge. I drove to the Phoenician resort, where I checked into a suite and ordered room service. I ate in silence while reviewing the mental inventory of everything I knew about our business, our finances, our vulnerabilities. By the time I finished dinner, I had the outline of a plan that would have impressed even Victoria Hamilton with its thoroughness and precision. David had made one crucial mistake in his betrayal. He had assumed that I was simply the supportive wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who made coffee and remembered birthdays, but had no real understanding of the business we had built together. He had forgotten that I had been there from the beginning, that I had helped create every system and process that made Morrison Tech successful. He was about to learn just how expensive that oversight would be. The next morning, I woke early and dressed with particular care. I chose a charcoal gray suit that conveyed authority and professionalism, paired with my good pearls and the watch David had given me for my 60th birthday. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a woman who understood business and wouldn't be intimidated or dismissed. I arrived at the Morrison Tech offices at 8:30, 30 minutes before my scheduled meeting with David. The building was one of those sleek glass and steel structures that had become synonymous with successful technology companies, all clean lines and modern efficiency. David and I had moved the company here 5 years earlier when our previous space became too small for our growing team. I used my key card to enter through the executive entrance, a privilege I had maintained even though I had never held an official position with the company. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric patterns across the polished floors and contemporary furniture that I had helped select during the office renovation. My destination was the conference room that David used for important meetings, a space I had suggested we create when the company expanded beyond the point where his office could accommodate larger groups. The room featured a massive mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, with a wall of windows overlooking the Phoenix skyline and an impressive display of awards and recognition certificates that chronicled the company's success. I set up my laptop and arranged my papers at one end of the table, claiming the power position that faced the door. I wanted David to understand immediately that this wasn't a personal conversation between hurt spouses, but a business negotiation between equals. Or perhaps, I thought with a slight smile, between predator and prey. At precisely 9 o'clock, David entered the conference room looking like a man who hadn't slept well. His usually immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and his hair not quite perfectly styled. He carried a coffee cup that he gripped like a lifeline and moved with the careful deliberation of someone who knows he's walking into a battle he can't win. "Thank you for coming," I said formally, as if he were a client rather than my husband of 30 years. He sat across from me, maintaining more distance than was necessary in the large room. "Kat, before we start, I want you to know how sorry I am about last night. Amanda shouldn't have made that announcement without discussing it with me first. But she wasn't wrong about the facts, was she?" I opened my laptop and pulled up the first document I wanted to show him. You are the father of her child. You have been having an affair for 8 months, and you did decide to let me find out in the most public and humiliating way possible. I never intended for it to happen this way, he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. I know how it looked, how it must have felt for you. How it felt is irrelevant, I replied, my tone businesslike and cold. How it affects our business partnership is what we need to discuss. He blinked in surprise. Our business partnership? David, surely you didn't think I was going to sit quietly in the background while you restructure your life around your new family. I turned my laptop screen toward him, showing him the first spreadsheet Victoria and I had prepared during our early morning phone call. This is a comprehensive analysis of my contributions to Morrison Tech over the past 30 years, including my initial investment, my unpaid labor, my business development efforts, and my ongoing operational support. His face went pale as he scrolled through the detailed breakdown of everything I had done to help build the company he considered his personal achievement. The numbers were undeniable, the documentation thorough, the implications staggering. I don't understand what you're trying to say, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm saying that Morrison Tech isn't your company, David. It's our company, and I'm claiming my half. The silence that followed my declaration stretched. Between us like a chasm neither of us knew how to cross. David stared at the laptop screen, his eyes moving across the columns of figures that represented 3 decades of my life poured into his dream. I watched his face carefully, noting the moment when understanding dawned, followed quickly by panic, then a desperate attempt to regain control of a conversation that had already slipped entirely from his grasp. Kat, you can't be serious, he finally said, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to reason with a person he believed was having an emotional breakdown. You're upset about Amanda, and I understand that completely. But you can't just claim half of my company because you're angry. I leaned back in my chair and studied him with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating specimen. This was the man I had shared my bed with for 30 years, the man whose dreams had become my dreams, whose success I had celebrated as if it were my own. And he genuinely believed that Morrison Tech belonged solely to him, that my contributions had been merely supportive, easily dismissed, legally meaningless. Your company? I repeated softly. David, let me share something with you that might clarify the situation. I pulled out a manila folder that Victoria had prepared for me and placed it on the table between us. These are copies of the incorporation documents from 1994, when we formally established Morrison Tech Solutions. Notice anything interesting about the founding partners listed? He opened the folder with trembling hands, and I watched his face drain of color as he read documents he apparently hadn't looked at in years. There, in black and white legal language, were both our names listed as equal founding partners of Morrison Tech Solutions, LLC. David Morrison and Catherine Elena Morrison, each holding 50% ownership of the newly formed company. I don't understand, he said, flipping through the pages as if looking for fine print that would restore his version of reality. You never worked for the company officially. You didn't draw a salary. You weren't involved in the day-to-day operations, weren't I? I opened my laptop again and began clicking through a presentation that Victoria and I had spent half the night preparing. Let's review some of those day-to-day operations, shall we? The first slide showed a photograph of our original apartment, office, with me clearly visible answering phones at a desk positioned next to David's workspace. 1993 to 1997, I managed all client communications, maintained the financial records, and coordinated project timelines. No salary, of course, because we couldn't afford to pay anyone, including ourselves most months. The next slide displayed copies of contracts from our early years, all bearing my signature as co-signatory, and many including clauses I had negotiated directly with clients. 1998 to 2003, I served as unofficial business development manager, securing and maintaining relationships with our first major corporate clients. Still no official salary, but we were building equity together, weren't we, David? I advanced to the next slide, which showed photographs from various company events and client meetings where I was clearly present as more than just a spouse. 2004 to 2010, I managed all client relations for our expansion into the healthcare sector, personally overseeing the implementation of systems that still generate 40% of our annual revenue. David's breathing had become shallow, and he was gripping his coffee cup so tightly I was afraid it might shatter in his hands. Kat, even if you contributed to the company's success, that doesn't necessarily mean you have legal ownership rights. The fact that both our names are on some old paperwork doesn't prove anything. I smiled, and I could see that my expression made him distinctly uncomfortable. Actually, David, it proves everything. But let me continue with my presentation, because we're just getting to the really interesting part. The next series of slides documented what I called the hidden years, the period from 2011 to the present, when David had apparently convinced himself that his success was entirely self-generated. I showed him photographs of meetings I had attended, contracts I had reviewed, strategic decisions I had influenced, and client relationships I had maintained, all while he focused on the more glamorous aspects of running a growing technology company. Here's something I think you'll find particularly enlightening, I said, clicking to a slide that displayed a detailed financial analysis. This chart shows Morrison Tech's revenue growth over the past decade, with specific annotation of which contracts and client relationships I personally managed or influenced. The numbers were devastating to his narrative. 67% of the company's growth since 2011 could be directly attributed to accounts I had developed, clients I had retained, or strategic decisions I had influenced. I had been far more than a supportive spouse or gracious hostess. I had been an active, essential partner in every aspect of the business except the official recognition. I've also included a breakdown of the value I added through cost savings, I continued, advancing to the next slide. My management of vendor relationships, my coordination of office relocations, my oversight of employee benefit negotiations. The total value of my contributions over the past 30 years exceeds $14 million. David was no longer trying to maintain his composure. He pushed the laptop away from him and stood up abruptly, beginning to pace around the conference room like a caged animal searching for an escape route that didn't exist. This is insane, Kat. You can't just decide that you own half of my life's work because you're angry about Amanda. We can work through this personal situation without destroying everything I've built. Everything we built, I corrected firmly. And I'm not angry about Amanda, David. I'm angry about 30 years of being treated like an employee without pay, a partner without recognition, a co-founder without respect. I closed the laptop and leaned forward, fixing him with the kind of direct stare that had once made difficult clients back down during tense negotiations. Amanda's pregnancy was simply the catalyst that opened my eyes to how thoroughly you've rewritten our history to suit your convenience. You've spent so many years taking credit for our shared achievements that you actually started believing your own mythology. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression cycling through anger, desperation, and something that might have been the first glimmer of genuine respect he'd shown me in years. What do you want, Kat? Money? I can arrange for a generous settlement, something that reflects your contributions fairly without disrupting the company's operations. I want what's legally mine, I said simply. 50% ownership of Morrison Tech Solutions, recognition as co-founder and managing partner, and immediate implementation of proper governance structures that reflect our actual partnership. That's impossible, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The company employs 87 people, Kat. We have obligations to clients, contracts that require continuity, systems that can't be disrupted by internal power struggles. You should have thought about that before you decided to start a family with your assistant, I replied coolly. But you're right about one thing. We do have obligations to our employees and clients, which is why I'm prepared to be reasonable about the transition process. I pulled out another document from Victoria's folder, a detailed transition plan that addressed every concern David had raised and several he hadn't thought of yet. This outlines how we can restructure the company's leadership to reflect our actual partnership while maintaining operational stability. I'm not interested in destroying what we've built, David. I'm interested in claiming my rightful place in it. He read through the transition plan with the focused attention of a man trying to find flaws in a contract that might save his life. The document was comprehensive and professionally drafted, addressing everything from client communications to employee notifications to board governance structures. Victoria had done excellent work, creating a roadmap that would allow Morrison Tech to continue thriving under new leadership arrangements while protecting the interests of all stakeholders. This would make you my equal partner in everything, he said finally, looking up from the papers with an expression I couldn't quite read. I've always been your equal partner in everything, I replied. The only difference is that now it will be official, documented, and legally protected. David sank back into his chair, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked truly defeated. Not just surprised or challenged or temporarily set back, but completely outmaneuvered by an opponent he had never even realized he was facing. How long have you been planning this? He asked quietly. I started planning this about 4 hours after Amanda made her announcement, I said truthfully. But the foundation for this conversation was laid 30 years ago when we incorporated as equal partners. I'm not seizing power, David. I'm reclaiming it. He was quiet for several minutes, staring out the conference room windows at the Phoenix skyline where we had built our life together. I could see him processing the implications of my proposal, calculating the costs of resistance versus cooperation, trying to find some alternative that would allow him to maintain control while appeasing my demands. What about Amanda? He finally asked. What about the baby? What about them? I replied. Your personal relationships are your business, David. My concern is with our professional partnership and ensuring that my contributions to this company are properly recognized and protected going forward. You're really going to force me to choose between my company and my family? I stood up and began gathering my papers, the meeting clearly drawing to a close. I'm not forcing you to choose anything. You already made your choices when you started an affair, when you got Amanda pregnant, and when you allowed her to announce your new family at our company party. Now, you're simply living with the consequences of those choices. Kat, please, he said, and there was genuine desperation in his voice now. We can find another way to handle this. We don't have to blow up 30 years of marriage and partnership over one mistake. I paused at the door and looked back at him. This man who had been the center of my world for most of my adult life, but who had somehow forgotten that I was supposed to be the center of his. David, this isn't about one mistake. This is about 30 years of being invisible in my own life, of watching you accept credit for achievements that belonged to both of us, of building something together that you claimed as yours alone. I never meant to make you feel invisible, he said softly. I know you didn't, I replied, and for the first time in our conversation, my voice carried genuine sadness rather than cold determination. You didn't mean to erase me, but you did. It anyway. Every time you introduced yourself as the founder of Morrison Tech without mentioning my role, every time you gave interviews about your success story without acknowledging that it was our success story, every time you made major business decisions without consulting the person who actually understood our operations better than anyone else. I opened the door but didn't leave immediately. You have 48 hours to review my proposal with your attorney and provide me with a response. After that, I'll be forced to pursue other options that might be less convenient for everyone involved. What other options? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Dissolution of the partnership, I said simply. Liquidation of assets. division of client accounts, termination of existing contracts pending renegotiation with new entities. All the messy, expensive, time-consuming legal processes that happen when business partners can't reach amicable agreements. The color drained from his face again as he contemplated the implications. Morrison Tech's value was largely built on continuity, client relationships, and operational efficiency. A forced dissolution would destroy much of what made the company valuable, leaving everyone involved with significantly less than they started with. "You would really do that?" he asked. "You would destroy everything we built just to prove a point?" "I would do that to claim what's rightfully mine," I corrected. "But I'd prefer not to, which is why I'm offering you a civilized alternative. The choice is yours, David." I left him sitting in the conference room and walked through the offices of Morrison Tech with new eyes. The bustling workspace filled with dedicated employees who had helped build something remarkable. The modern equipment and sophisticated systems that processed millions of dollars in business every year. The walls covered with awards and recognition that celebrated our shared achievements, even if only David's name appeared on most of the certificates. As I passed Amanda's desk, I noticed it was empty. No personal belongings, no family photographs, no indication that anyone worked there regularly. She had apparently taken some time off following her dramatic announcement, or perhaps David had suggested she make herself scarce while we sorted through the implications of her revelation. I took the elevator down to the parking garage and sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. The conversation with David had gone better than I had hoped, largely because his position was far weaker than he had realized. The incorporation documents alone were enough to establish my legal claim to equal ownership, but the detailed documentation of my ongoing contributions made any challenge to my partnership status virtually impossible to defend. Victoria had explained during our lengthy phone consultation that Arizona's community property laws would also work in my favor if David chose to fight rather than negotiate. Even if he somehow managed to dispute my business partnership claims, I would still be entitled to half of all assets acquired during our marriage, including his share of Morrison Tech. The only question was whether we could reach a reasonable agreement, or whether I would be forced to pursue more aggressive legal remedies. I drove home through the familiar Phoenix streets, past the restaurants where David and I had celebrated business successes, the hotels where we had hosted client events, the landmarks that marked the geography of our shared life. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, but I felt like I was seeing it all for the first time, understanding finally that this was my city too, my success too, my life too, regardless of whose name appeared on the business cards and letterhead. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, no longer the comfortable retreat where I had played the role of supportive spouse, but rather a stage set for a performance that was finally ending. I moved through the rooms methodically, noting which furniture and artwork we had purchased together, which items held sentimental value, which possessions would need to be considered in any eventual settlement discussions. In David's home office, I found evidence of a life I had only partially understood, financial documents that showed business accounts I hadn't known existed, correspondence with attorneys and accountants that suggested he had been planning significant changes to our arrangements long before Amanda's pregnancy announcement, travel receipts for trips I hadn't known he had taken, some of them clearly, romantic getaways that hadn't included me. The most revealing discovery was a folder labeled Estate Planning Updates that contained draft documents proposing significant changes to our wills and financial arrangements. The proposed changes would have reduced my inheritance substantially while creating generous provisions for Amanda and any children David might have with her. The documents were dated 6 months earlier, confirming that this affair had been far more serious and long-term than David had admitted. I photographed everything with my phone, creating a digital record that Victoria could use to strengthen our negotiating position. David's preparations for his new life had been thorough and methodical, but he had made one crucial error. He had assumed that I would accept whatever arrangements he chose to make, that my role in his life was so passive and dependent that I would never challenge his decisions. That evening, I cooked dinner for one for the first time in 30 years. Not a lonely, sad meal, but a deliberate celebration of my newfound independence. I opened a bottle of wine that David and I had been saving for a special occasion, deciding that reclaiming my own life qualified as special enough. I ate slowly, savoring both the food and the silence, planning my next moves in the chess game that my marriage had apparently always been, even though I was only now learning the rules. David came home around 9 o'clock, moving through the house with the careful uncertainty of someone who no longer felt confident about his welcome. He found me in the living room, reading a book and enjoying my wine, looking remarkably composed for someone whose life had been turned upside down less than 24 hours earlier. "We need to talk," he said, settling into his usual chair, but perching on the edge as if prepared to flee at any moment. "I thought we had talked," I replied, not looking up from my book. "You have 48 hours to respond to my proposal. Until then, there's really nothing more to discuss." "Kat, please be reasonable. What you're asking for would fundamentally change everything about how Morrison Tech operates. I can't just hand over half the company to you overnight." I closed my book and set it aside, finally giving him my full attention. "David Morrison, Tech has always been half mine. The only thing that's changing is that I'm no longer willing to pretend otherwise." "But you don't understand the technical aspects of the business," he protested. "You haven't been involved in the software development, the project management systems, the client implementation processes." "Haven't I?" I smiled, and I could see that my expression made him nervous. "David, who do you think coordinated the Peterson Industries implementation? Who managed the client relationship during the Henderson Group crisis last year? Who developed the training protocols that we use for new employee orientation?" His face went pale as he realized that I had been far more involved in the company's operations than he had either noticed or acknowledged. "You were consulting with me on those projects, but that's different from actually running day-to-day operations." "Is it?" I stood up and walked to the bookshelf where I kept my personal files, pulling out a thick binder that David had apparently never bothered to examine. "This contains copies of every email I've sent on behalf of Morrison Tech for the past 5 years, every client communication I've handled, every problem I've solved while you were traveling or in meetings or otherwise occupied." I handed him the binder and watched his expression change as he flipped through hundreds of pages of documentation that proved my active, ongoing involvement in virtually every aspect of the business he considered his personal domain. "I didn't realize you were keeping such detailed records," he said weakly. "I wasn't keeping them for this purpose," I replied. "I was keeping them because I'm a professional who documents my work, even when that work isn't officially recognized or compensated." He set the binder aside and looked at me with something approaching genuine curiosity. "Who are you, Kat? I feel like I'm talking to a stranger." "I'm the same person I've always been," I said simply. "The only difference is that I'm no longer hiding my competence behind your comfort. I'm no longer pretending to be less capable than I am because it makes you feel more important." "I never asked you to pretend to be less capable." "You didn't have to ask. You just accepted it when I stepped back, when I downplayed my contributions, when I allowed you to take credit for work we did together. It was easier for both of us if you were the brilliant entrepreneur and I was the supportive wife." David stood up and began pacing again, a habit I now realized he employed whenever he felt cornered or overwhelmed. "Even if everything you're saying is true, even if you have legitimate claims to partnership in the company, we can't just ignore 30 years of established operational structures. There are legal implications, tax consequences, employee concerns, all of which have been addressed in the transition plan I showed you this morning," I replied patiently. "Victoria is one of the best corporate attorneys in Phoenix, David. She doesn't draft proposals that create unnecessary legal exposure or operational disruption. Victoria Hamilton is representing you in this? He stopped pacing and stared at me with genuine alarm. Kat, she's a shark. She's the attorney people hire when they want to destroy their opponents completely. She's the attorney people hire when they want to ensure their interests are properly protected, I corrected. And yes, she's representing me, because unlike you, I understand the value of professional expertise when navigating complex legal situations. The conversation continued for another hour, with David alternating between attempts to negotiate, threats of legal action, and emotional appeals to our shared history. I listened patiently, responded factually, and refused to be drawn into the kind of dramatic confrontation that might cloud my judgment or weaken my position. When he finally retreated to the guest bedroom, I remained in the living room, finishing my wine and reviewing the events of what had been one of the most transformative days of my life. In less than 24 hours, I had evolved from betrayed wife to business partner demanding recognition, from passive victim to active agent of my own destiny. The woman who had served champagne at last night's party felt like someone I had known in another lifetime. That woman had trusted completely, had subordinated her own interests entirely, had believed that her husband's success was sufficient recognition for her contributions. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own value and was prepared to fight for it. I went to bed in the master bedroom, alone but not lonely, surrounded by the familiar comforts of a life I had helped create but was no longer willing to share on someone else's terms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new opportunities to define the future on my own terms rather than accepting whatever arrangements David chose to offer. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about Amanda and the child she was carrying. David's biological legacy that would complicate our business relationship regardless of how we resolved our partnership disputes. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, I was simply Catherine Morrison, co-founder and equal partner of Morrison Tech Solutions, finally ready to claim the recognition that had always been rightfully mine. The next morning brought an unexpected development that changed the trajectory of our negotiations in ways I could never have anticipated. I was drinking coffee and reviewing Victoria's latest revisions to our partnership proposal when my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. Mrs. Morrison? The voice was young, nervous, clearly uncomfortable with whatever conversation was about to unfold. This is Catherine Morrison, I replied carefully. My name is Jessica Chen, and I work in accounting at Morrison Tech. I'm sorry to bother you at home, but there's something I think you need to know about the company's financial situation. I felt a chill run down my spine as I recognized the name. Jessica was Robert Chen's daughter, a recent college graduate who had been working part-time in our accounting department while studying for her CPA certification. She was bright, detail-oriented, and exactly the kind of person who might notice discrepancies that others would miss. What kind of something, Jessica? There are irregularities in some of the account transfers from the past 8 months, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Large amounts of money being moved between accounts in ways that don't match the documentation I've been given to reconcile. 8 months, the same timeline as David's affair with Amanda. Can you be more specific about these irregularities? I asked, already reaching for a notepad to document whatever she was about to tell me. I probably shouldn't be calling you about this, she said, clearly second-guessing her decision to reach out. But my father always said you were the one person at Morrison Tech who really understood how everything worked, and these discrepancies are making me nervous about the integrity of our financial systems. Jessica, you did the right thing by calling me, I said firmly. Can you meet me somewhere private where we can review these concerns in detail? We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near the university, a neutral location where a young woman, meeting with an older woman wouldn't attract attention or speculation. I arrived early and chose a corner table where we could speak privately. my mind racing with implications of what Jessica might have discovered. She arrived carrying a laptop, bag, and looking like someone who hadn't slept well in several days. Jessica was a petite young woman with her father's serious demeanor and an attention to detail that had obviously served her well in her accounting studies. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said as she sat down across from me. I wasn't sure who else I could talk to about this. "Show me what you found," I said simply. She opened her laptop and pulled up a series of spreadsheets that documented financial transactions dating back to the beginning of David's relationship with Amanda. The patterns she had identified were subtle but unmistakable, once you knew what to look for. Regular transfers from Morrison Tech's operating accounts to a separate investment account that had been established 8 months earlier. "The amounts aren't huge individually," Jessica explained, "but they add up to almost $400,000 over the past 8 months. And the documentation I've been given to justify these transfers doesn't match the actual business purposes they're supposed to serve." I studied the spreadsheets carefully, noting the dates and amounts of each transfer. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental, and the lack of proper documentation suggested that these transactions were being deliberately obscured from normal oversight processes. "Who authorized these transfers?" I asked. "That's the strange part," Jessica replied. "The authorization signatures look like your husband's, but they're not following the normal approval process that requires dual sign-off for transfers over $50,000. I felt anger building in my chest, not the hot rage of someone discovering a betrayal, but the cold fury of a business professional realizing that her partner had been systematically stealing from their shared enterprise. "Jessica, I need you to print copies of everything you've shown me," I said. "And I need you to secure the original electronic files in a way that prevents them from being altered or deleted." "Are you going to confront Mr. Morrison about this?" she asked nervously. "Eventually," I replied. "But first, I'm going to make sure we have complete documentation of these irregularities and a clear understanding of where this money has gone." The meeting with Jessica lasted another 30 minutes as she walked me through the technical details of what she had discovered and explained her concerns about the broader implications for Morrison Tech's financial integrity. By the time we parted ways, I had a clear picture of how David had been funding his new relationship and preparing for his new family. I drove directly to Victoria's office, where I presented her with Jessica's findings and watched her expression harden as she reviewed the evidence of David's financial misconduct. "This changes everything," Victoria said, leaning back in her chair with the satisfied expression of an attorney who had just been handed a winning case. "Financial misappropriation from a business partnership is a serious matter, Kat. This isn't just about relationship betrayal anymore. This is about criminal misconduct." "What are our options?" I asked. "We have several choices," Victoria replied, pulling out a legal pad to outline our strategy. "We can use this evidence to strengthen your claim to equal partnership and demand immediate remediation of the stolen funds. We can file criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud, or we can use this information as leverage to negotiate a settlement that gives you everything you want without destroying David's life completely." I considered the options carefully, weighing the satisfaction of seeing David face criminal charges against the practical benefits of using this information strategically. "What would you recommend?" "I'd recommend leveraging this information to secure your partnership rights immediately, while also demanding full restitution of the stolen funds plus damages," Victoria said. "If David refuses to cooperate, we can always pursue criminal charges later. But right now, this gives you tremendous negotiating power." We spent the next 2 hours revising our partnership proposal to include the new information Jessica had provided. The updated document was devastating to David's position, offering him a choice between voluntary cooperation and criminal prosecution for financial misconduct. When I returned home that afternoon, I found David waiting for me in the living room with an expression that suggested he had spent the day in consultation with his own attorney. "We need to discuss your proposal," he said without preamble. Actually, we need to discuss my revised proposal, I replied, handing him the updated document that Victoria had prepared. It seems there are additional issues we need to address, beyond simple partnership recognition. I watched his face change as he read through the financial misconduct allegations and realized that his secret funding of his relationship with Amanda had been discovered and documented. Kat, I can explain. The account transfers, he began. But I held up my hand to stop him. Save your explanations for your attorney, I said calmly. Right now, I'm only interested in your response to my revised proposal. The document laid out my demands in clear, unambiguous terms. Immediate recognition as equal partner and co-founder of Morrison Tech. Full restitution of the misappropriated funds plus 20% damages. Implementation of proper financial oversight and governance structures to prevent future irregularities. And a formal apology to be distributed to all employees acknowledging my contributions to the company's success. If you refuse these terms, I continued, Victoria will be filing criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud, along with a civil lawsuit seeking dissolution of the partnership and damages for breach of fiduciary duty. David set the document aside and looked at me with something approaching genuine fear. You would really send me to prison over this? I would really hold you accountable for stealing from our business to fund your affair, I replied. What happens next is entirely up to you. The 48 hours that followed our conversation passed with excruciating slowness, each minute stretching like an eternity, while David wrestled with the impossible choice I had presented him. I used the time productively, meeting with Victoria, to finalize our legal strategy and coordinating with Jessica Chen to ensure that all financial evidence was properly secured and documented. I also began reaching out to key Morrison Tech employees, not to discuss the situation directly, but to gauge their loyalty and assess how they might react to significant changes in company leadership. During this period, I maintained a facade of normalcy that must have been maddening for David to witness. I continued my regular routines, attended my book club meeting, had lunch with my sister Margaret, and even hosted our monthly dinner for David's elderly mother, who remained blissfully unaware of the crisis unfolding around her. Throughout it all, I projected the calm confidence of someone who had already won the war and was simply waiting for the formal surrender. David, by contrast, looked increasingly haggard with each passing hour. He made numerous phone calls behind closed doors, presumably consulting with attorneys and accountants who were no doubt explaining the weakness of his position and the strength of my claims. He attempted several times to engage me in conversation about compromise solutions or alternative arrangements, but I maintained my position that we had nothing to discuss until he formally responded to my proposal. On the morning of the deadline, I dressed with particular care, choosing a navy blue suit that conveyed both professionalism and authority. I wanted to look like exactly what I was claiming to be, a serious business leader who demanded respect and recognition. Victoria had scheduled a meeting at her office where David could present his response in a formal legal setting, eliminating any possibility of emotional manipulation or personal appeals that might cloud the clarity of our business negotiation. I arrived at Victoria's office early, using the extra time to review our documentation one final time and prepare for whatever counteroffer or delaying tactics David might attempt. Victoria's confidence in our position was absolute, but she had warned me that desperate people often make unpredictable choices, and David was certainly desperate. At precisely 10 o'clock, David arrived accompanied by his attorney, Martin Crawford, a corporate lawyer I recognized from various business events over the years. Martin was competent, but not exceptional, the kind of attorney you might hire for routine business matters, but not the sort you would want representing you in a high-stakes negotiation against someone of Victoria's caliber. The four of us sat around Victoria's conference table, the formal setting emphasizing that this was a business meeting rather than a marital dispute. Victoria had arranged the documents in neat stacks, each category clearly labeled and indexed, for easy reference. The evidence of my partnership claims, the documentation of David's financial misconduct, and the legal precedents supporting our position created an impressive display of preparation and professionalism. Martin opened the discussion by attempting to characterize my claims as emotional overreach driven by marital discord rather than legitimate business concerns. Victoria dismantled this argument methodically, walking him through the incorporation, documents, the financial records, and the detailed documentation of my contributions to Morrison Tech's success. "Mr. Crawford," Victoria said with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow student, "your client seems to be operating under the mistaken impression that his wife's contributions to their business were somehow voluntary gifts, rather than the work of an equal partner. The law does not support this interpretation." Martin shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly recognizing that his opening strategy had failed completely. "Ms. Hamilton, even if Mrs. Morrison has legitimate partnership claims, surely we can reach some accommodation that doesn't require fundamental restructuring of an established business." "What sort of accommodation did you have in mind?" Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer would be inadequate. David leaned forward, speaking directly to me for the first time since entering the conference room. "Kat, I'm prepared to offer you a substantial financial settlement that recognizes your contributions to the company's success. We're talking about enough money to ensure your complete financial security for the rest of your life." "How substantial?" I asked, though I was primarily curious about whether his offer would reveal any understanding of my actual value to the business. Martin consulted his notes and named a figure that was genuinely impressive by most standards, but represented less than 20% of my actual ownership stake in Morrison Tech. The lowball offer confirmed that David still didn't understand either the strength of my legal position or the extent of my knowledge about the company's true value. "That's an interesting starting point," Victoria said diplomatically, "but it falls somewhat short of reflecting Mrs. Morrison's actual partnership stake. Perhaps we should review the valuation methodology that led to this offer." What followed was a detailed discussion of Morrison Tech's financial value, during which it became clear that David's attorney had performed only a superficial analysis of the company's assets and revenue streams. Victoria's preparation was infinitely more thorough, including independent appraisals of intellectual property, client relationship values, and future earning potential that painted a picture of a business worth significantly more than David had claimed. The revelation that most rattled David was Victoria's analysis of how much value I had personally created through my client relationship management and business development efforts. Using conservative calculations based on client retention rates and account growth, Victoria demonstrated that my contributions had generated over $23 million in company value during the past decade alone. Even if we ignore Mrs. Morrison's founding partnership status, Victoria explained to the increasingly pale Martin Crawford, her ongoing contributions to company operations would entitle her to substantial compensation and equity participation under any reasonable partnership agreement. David's composure finally cracked when Victoria presented the evidence of his financial misconduct. The documentation Jessica had provided was devastating, showing a clear pattern of unauthorized fund transfers that violated both partnership agreements and basic fiduciary responsibilities. "These transfers were temporary loans," David protested. Weakly, "I was planning to reimburse the company once certain personal financial matters were resolved." "Temporary loans require documentation and authorization," Victoria replied coolly. "What we have here is unauthorized appropriation of partnership assets for personal use, which constitutes both a breach of fiduciary duty and potential criminal fraud." Martin requested a brief recess to consult privately with his client, and I watched through the conference room's glass walls as he delivered what appeared to be very unwelcome legal advice. David's body language grew increasingly defensive as Martin presumably explained the weakness of their position and the potential consequences of continued resistance. When they returned to the table, Martin's demeanor had shifted from confident advocacy to damage control. Ms. Hamilton, my client is prepared to consider a more substantial settlement offer, but we need assurance that accepting such an arrangement would resolve all potential claims, including any allegations related to financial irregularities. Mr. Crawford, Victoria said with a slight smile, I think you misunderstand the nature of these proceedings. We're not here to negotiate a settlement of Mrs. Morrison's claims. We're here to formalize recognition of her existing ownership rights and address the remediation of funds that were improperly diverted from partnership accounts. The distinction was crucial and devastating to David's position. Victoria was not asking David to pay me a settlement as if I were an injured party seeking compensation. She was demanding that he acknowledge my equal ownership of assets that already belonged to me and return money that he had stolen from our shared business. This is ridiculous, David finally exploded, his professional composure collapsing under the pressure of realizing how completely he had been outmaneuvered. Kat, you can't seriously expect me to hand over half of everything I've worked for my entire life because you're upset about Amanda. I expect you to acknowledge half of everything we've worked for our entire lives, I replied calmly, because that's what the law requires and what basic fairness demands. You don't know the first thing about running a technology company, he continued, his voice rising with desperation. You don't understand the technical requirements, the project management complexities, the client service demands. You can't just waltz in and demand equal control of something you're not qualified to manage. Victoria and I exchanged glances, and I could see her fighting back a smile at David's tactical error. His argument that I was unqualified to manage? Morrison Tech directly contradicted his earlier claims that I hadn't been significantly involved in company operations. David, I said quietly, who managed the Peterson Industries implementation when you were hospitalized with pneumonia 3 years ago? He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it as he realized the trap he had walked into. Who coordinated the crisis response when our primary server farm failed during the Henderson Group conversion? I continued. His face was growing redder with each question, and I could see Martin Crawford beginning to understand just how poorly prepared they were for this confrontation. Who developed the employee training protocols that reduced our client implementation timeline by 30% over the past 2 years? You were consulting with the team on those projects, David said weakly, but that doesn't mean you were actually managing them. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder containing hundreds of emails, project reports, and client communications that documented my direct involvement in every aspect of Morrison Tech's operations. Would you like me to read some of the feedback from our clients about my project management and technical coordination? Victoria leaned forward slightly, sensing that the moment had come to deliver the final blow to David's resistance. Mr. Crawford, I think it would be helpful if your client understood the full scope of our demands and the consequences of refusing to meet them. She pulled out a document I hadn't seen before, a comprehensive legal filing that outlined our complete strategy for pursuing my partnership claims through both civil and criminal proceedings. The filing was impressive in its thoroughness and terrifying in its implications for David's personal and professional future. If Mr. Morrison refuses to voluntarily acknowledge Mrs. Morrison's partnership rights, Victoria explained, we are prepared to file suit for partnership dissolution, embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The criminal charges alone carry potential penalties of up to 15 years in prison and complete forfeiture of business assets. Martin's face went white as he scanned the legal filing, clearly realizing for the first time the full extent of his client's legal exposure. This seems excessive for what amounts to a marital dispute with some business complications. Mr. Crawford, Victoria said with ice in her voice. Your characterization of these issues as a marital dispute suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of the legal situation. Mrs. Morrison is not seeking a divorce settlement. She is claiming her rightful ownership of a business she co-founded and helped build over 30 years. The meeting continued for another hour as Victoria systematically destroyed every argument Martin attempted to raise in David's defense. The incorporation documents were unambiguous. The evidence of my ongoing contributions was overwhelming. The documentation of David's financial misconduct was irrefutable, and the potential legal consequences of continued resistance were catastrophic. When we finally broke for lunch, David looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the course of a single morning. Martin pulled Victoria aside for a private conversation that lasted several minutes, presumably to discuss the possibility of a negotiated surrender that might salvage some dignity from David's complete defeat. During the lunch break, I walked to a nearby park and sat on a bench overlooking a small pond where families were feeding ducks and children were playing on expensive playground equipment. The scene was peaceful and normal, a stark contrast to the high-stakes legal battle I was fighting just a few blocks away. I thought about the woman I had been just a week earlier, someone who would have been horrified by the idea of destroying her husband's life over business disagreements. That woman had believed that marriage meant subordinating your own interests to your partner's success, that love required endless sacrifice and selfless support, regardless of whether that support was appreciated or reciprocated. The woman sitting on that park bench was someone entirely different. She understood that respect had to be earned and maintained, that partnerships required mutual acknowledgement and shared decision-making, that love without recognition was just another form of exploitation. She was prepared to fight for what belonged to her, not out of spite or revenge, but out of a fundamental belief that she deserved to be treated as an equal rather than a subordinate. When we reconvened after lunch, Martin's demeanor had changed completely. The aggressive advocacy of the morning had been replaced by the resigned professionalism of someone preparing to negotiate the terms of his client's surrender. "Ms. Hamilton," he began, "my client is prepared to discuss the practical implementation of Mrs. Morrison's partnership recognition, provided we can reach agreement on certain operational details." Victoria nodded graciously, recognizing a capitulation when she heard one. "We're certainly willing to discuss implementation details, Mr. Crawford. Mrs. Morrison has no interest in disrupting the company's operations unnecessarily." What followed was a detailed negotiation about how to restructure Morrison Tech's leadership and governance to reflect my equal partnership status. The discussion covered everything from board composition to decision-making authority to public representation of the company. David participated reluctantly in these conversations, occasionally attempting to preserve some exclusive authority over technical decisions or strategic planning, but Victoria consistently redirected the discussion back to the principle of equal partnership that governed all aspects of our business relationship. The most challenging negotiation involved the timeline for implementing the changes. David argued that immediate restructuring would create unnecessary disruption and confusion among employees and clients, while I insisted that any delay in recognizing my partnership status was unacceptable after 30 years of being marginalized. Victoria proposed a compromise that satisfied both concerns: immediate legal recognition of my partnership status with a 90-day transition period for implementing operational changes. This approach would provide time for careful communication with employees and clients while ensuring that my rights were protected immediately. The financial aspects of our agreement were more straightforward. David would immediately reimburse the partnership for all unauthorized transfers, plus 20% damages as specified in our original proposal. Additionally, he would personally cover all legal costs associated with resolving these issues, including Victoria's substantial fees. By late afternoon, we had the framework of an agreement that would transform Morrison Tech from David's personal empire into our genuine partnership. The documentation would take several days to finalize, but the essential elements were settled. As we prepared to leave Victoria's office, David made one final attempt to salvage some control over the narrative of what was happening. "Kat," he said as we waited for the elevator, "I hope you understand that this agreement doesn't change the fact that you're still my wife. We still need to work through our personal relationships separately from these business issues." I looked at him with genuine curiosity, wondering if he truly believed that our marriage could survive the revelations of the past week, or if he was simply trying to preserve some illusion of normalcy. David, I replied quietly. Our personal relationship ended the moment Amanda announced she was carrying your child. What we're working through now is the dissolution of a business partnership that should have been formalized decades ago. The elevator arrived, and we rode down in Dindawa silence, each of us processing the implications of what had just transpired. When we reached the parking garage, David made one more attempt to engage me in conversation about our future, but I cut him off with a gesture. All communication going forward should go through Victoria, I said, walking toward my car. We're business partners now, David. Nothing more. That evening, I celebrated my victory with a quiet dinner at my favorite restaurant, a small Italian place where David and I had shared many anniversary dinners over the years. The irony of the location was not lost on me, but I chose it deliberately as a way of reclaiming spaces and experiences that had been defined by our relationship. I ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu and savored every sip while reviewing the preliminary agreement Victoria had drafted based on our day of negotiations. The document represented more than just a business arrangement. It was a declaration of independence from a life that had diminished me while elevating someone who had never fully appreciated my contributions. When I returned home, I found David in his office, surrounded by paperwork and looking like someone trying to understand how his carefully ordered world had collapsed so completely in such a short period of time. The partnership agreement will be finalized by Friday, I informed him from the doorway. Victoria will send you copies of all documents for review tomorrow. He looked up at me with an expression that mixed exhaustion, defeat, and something that might have been grudging respect. How long have you been planning this, Kat? How long have you known exactly what you were going to do when the time came? I've been preparing for this conversation my entire adult life, I replied truthfully. I just didn't realize it until Amanda forced me to examine what I had been accepting as normal. And what happens now? He asked. What happens to us? I considered the question carefully, looking at this man who had been the center of my life for 3 decades, but who had somehow forgotten that I was supposed to be the center of his. Now we find out whether you can learn to respect me as an equal partner, I said finally, or whether you prefer the version of me that never challenged your authority. I left him sitting in his office and went upstairs to pack the remaining belongings I would need for my extended stay at the Phoenician. I was no longer hiding from the situation or avoiding difficult conversations. I was simply creating the space I needed to begin building the next chapter of my life. The next morning brought news that changed everything once again, though this time the development worked entirely in my favor. Victoria called me at 7:30 with information that Jessica Chen had provided overnight. Kat, you need to see what Jessica discovered when she expanded her investigation into Morrison Tech's financial records, Victoria said, her voice carrying barely controlled excitement. Can you meet me at my office in an hour? I dressed quickly and drove through the early morning Phoenix traffic with a sense of anticipation that I couldn't quite explain. Jessica's original findings had been damaging enough to secure David's surrender, but Victoria's tone suggested that something even more significant had been uncovered. When I arrived at Victoria's office, I found Jessica waiting with a laptop and several boxes of printed documents. Her expression was grim but determined, like someone who had discovered something important and was prepared to see it through to its conclusion. Show Mrs. Morrison what you found, Victoria said without preamble. Jessica opened her laptop and began walking me through a complex web of financial transactions that painted a picture of misconduct far more extensive than we had originally suspected. The unauthorized transfers to fund David's relationship with Amanda were just the tip of the iceberg. Over the past 3 years, Jessica explained, there have been systematic diversions of company funds into investment accounts controlled solely by Mr. Morrison. The total amount exceeds $1.7 million. I felt my breath catch as I absorbed the implications of what she was telling me. David hadn't just been stealing money to fund his affair. He had been systematically looting our business. to build a personal fortune that I knew nothing about. The investment accounts were established using Morrison Tech's tax identification number, Jessica continued. But the ownership documents list only Mr. Morrison as the beneficiary. All of the gains from these investments have been flowing into accounts that you have no access to. Victoria pulled out a legal pad covered with notes and calculations. Based on the returns these investments have generated, David has accumulated approximately $2.4 million in assets that should belong to the partnership, but are currently under his sole control. The scope of David's financial betrayal was staggering, representing not just theft of current company funds, but the systematic diversion of investment opportunities that should have benefited both of us equally. He had been building a secret, financial empire using our shared resources while allowing me to believe that we were partners in everything. "There's more," Jessica said, pulling up another set of documents. "Some of these investment funds have been used to purchase real estate and establish business relationships that aren't disclosed in any of Morrison Tech's official records." She showed me property records for a vacation home in Sedona and a commercial real estate investment in Scottsdale, both purchased using funds that had been diverted from our partnership accounts. There were also consulting agreements with other technology companies that generated income flowing directly to David's personal accounts, rather than through Morrison Tech's books. "This is a completely parallel business operation," Victoria said, leaning back in her chair with the satisfied expression of an attorney who had just been handed an unwinnable case. "David has been using Morrison Tech as a source of capital for personal investments while hiding the returns from his partner." The evidence Jessica had compiled was overwhelming and devastating to any remaining credibility David might have claimed. This wasn't just marital infidelity or temporary financial impropriety. This was systematic fraud on a scale that could destroy his professional reputation and result in serious criminal charges. "What are our options now?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "We own him completely," Victoria said bluntly. "With this evidence, we can demand not only recognition of your partnership rights, but also restitution of all diverted funds plus damages, interest, and penalties. If he refuses, the criminal charges alone would put him in prison for decades." I studied the documents Jessica had prepared, marveling at the complexity and audacity of David's deception. He had spent years building a secret financial empire, while allowing me to believe that our modest lifestyle and conservative investments represented the full extent of our shared wealth. "How did he think he could hide this forever?" I asked. "He probably thought you would never have reason to look closely at the company's finances," Victoria replied. "Most spouses in traditional marriages don't have the expertise or motivation to conduct detailed financial audits of their partner's business operations." "But I'm not most spouses," I said, feeling a familiar anger building in my chest. "No," Victoria agreed with a slight smile. "You're definitely not most spouses." We spent the next 2 hours developing a revised strategy that took advantage of the new evidence Jessica had provided. The additional financial misconduct gave us leverage that went far beyond simple partnership recognition. We could now demand complete restructuring of Morrison Tech's operations, along with restitution that would effectively transfer most of David's accumulated wealth back to our shared accounts. The revised agreement Victoria drafted was comprehensive and devastating. David would not only acknowledge my equal partnership status, but also transfer all improperly accumulated assets back to the partnership, pay substantial damages and penalties, and submit to ongoing financial oversight to prevent future misconduct. "This agreement essentially gives you control of everything," Victoria explained as she walked me through the final document. "David will retain his partnership stake, but all major financial decisions will require your approval, and all company assets will be subject to joint oversight." "What if he refuses?" I asked. "Then we file criminal charges and civil suits that will destroy him completely," Victoria replied matter-of-factly. "With this evidence, he has no choice but to accept whatever terms we offer." I left Victoria's office with a sense of complete vindication that was both satisfying and slightly overwhelming. In less than a week, I had evolved from betrayed wife to equal business partner to effective controller of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The transformation was dizzying in its speed and thoroughness. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I called Morrison Tech's main number and asked to be transferred to the CEO's office. "Morrison Tech Solutions, this is Amanda speaking," came the familiar voice of David's pregnant secretary. "Amanda, this is Catherine." "Morrison," I said calmly. "Please tell David that I need to see him in the conference room at 4 o'clock this afternoon. It's regarding the new partnership agreement." There was a long pause before Amanda responded, her voice noticeably less confident than usual. "Mrs. Morrison, I'll give him the message. Should I plan to attend this meeting?" "That won't be necessary," I replied. "This is a discussion between business partners." I arrived at Morrison Tech 15 minutes early and used my key card to access the executive offices, moving through the familiar hallways with new authority. Several employees nodded politely as I passed, though I could see the curiosity in their expressions as they tried to understand why I was there during business hours looking so formal and purposeful. The conference room felt different when I entered it as an equal partner rather than a supportive spouse. I arranged my documents at the head of the table and waited for David to arrive, savoring the reversal of power that had occurred since our last meeting in this same space. David appeared precisely at 4 o'clock, looking haggard and defeated, but trying to maintain some semblance of professional dignity. He was accompanied by Martin Crawford, who looked like a man who had spent the day receiving very bad news from very expensive consultants. "Catherine," David said formally, "Martin and I have reviewed the additional allegations in your revised agreement. We need to discuss the feasibility of some of these demands." "There's nothing to discuss," I replied, sliding copies of Jessica's latest findings across the table. "Your attorney can review the evidence of your additional financial misconduct and advise you accordingly." Martin opened the folder and began scanning the documents, his expression growing increasingly grim as he absorbed the scope of what Jessica had uncovered. I watched him calculate the implications, probably trying to determine whether any defense strategy could survive such comprehensive evidence of systematic fraud. "These allegations are extremely serious," Martin said finally, looking up from the papers with obvious concern. "If accurate, they represent potential criminal liability far beyond anything we've previously discussed." "They're accurate," I said simply. "And they represent the theft of nearly $2.5 million from our partnership, not including interest and investment gains." David slumped in his chair, finally understanding that his situation had moved beyond damage control into complete surrender. "Kat, I never intended for any of this to happen. The investments were meant to benefit both of us eventually." "The investments were meant to benefit you exclusively," I corrected, "which is why all of the accounts list only your name, and why none of the returns were ever disclosed to your partner." Martin requested another private consultation with his client, and I watched through the glass walls as he apparently delivered the news that David's legal position was hopeless. When they returned, David's demeanor had shifted from defensive to defeated. "Mrs. Morrison," Martin said, his voice carrying the resignation of someone acknowledging inevitable defeat, "my client is prepared to accept the terms of your revised agreement, provided we can discuss the timeline for implementing the asset transfers." "The timeline is immediate," I replied. "All improperly diverted funds will be returned to partnership accounts within 30 days, and all investment assets will be transferred to joint control within 60 days. That timeline may create tax implications and liquidity challenges," Martin protested weakly. "Those are David's problems to solve," I said firmly. "He created these complications when he decided to steal from our partnership. He can deal with the consequences of unwinding his theft." The final negotiation lasted less than an hour, with Martin's resistance crumbling under the weight of evidence that made David's position completely indefensible. By the time we finished, I had achieved everything I had originally demanded, plus complete restitution of all stolen funds and effective control over all future financial decisions. As we prepared to leave, David made one final attempt to appeal to our personal history. "Kat, I know I've made terrible mistakes, but we can still rebuild our relationship if you're willing to forgive what I've done." I looked at him across the conference table. This man who had shared my life for 30 years, but had never truly seen me as an equal partner, worthy of respect and honesty. "David," I said quietly, "you didn't make mistakes. You made choices. You chose to have an affair, you chose to steal from our business, and you chose to build a secret financial empire while lying to me about our shared assets. Those weren't mistakes. They were deliberate decisions that revealed who you really are." "People can change," he said desperately. "I can learn to be a better partner, both personally and professionally." "Perhaps you can," I replied, standing and gathering my papers. "But you'll have to prove that to someone else. I'm done teaching men how to respect me." I left the conference room and walked through the Morrison Tech offices one more time, but now I was seeing them as the co-owner and managing partner rather than the supportive spouse. The transformation was complete, irreversible, and more satisfying than I had ever imagined possible. That evening, I moved my belongings out of the Phoenician and back into the house I had shared with David, but I chose the master bedroom while relegating him to the guest room. The symbolic reversal felt appropriate given our new relationship dynamic. I was no longer the woman who had served champagne at a company party while her husband's pregnant mistress made public announcements. I was Catherine Morrison, co-founder and controlling partner of Morrison Tech Solutions, a woman who had reclaimed her rightful place in a business she had helped build and a life she had helped create. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as we began implementing the partnership agreement and restructuring Morrison Tech's operations to reflect our new reality. But tonight, I was simply savoring the satisfaction of a battle won through intelligence, preparation, and an absolute refusal to accept less than I deserved. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal just 1 week earlier felt like someone from another lifetime. That woman had trusted completely and been rewarded with humiliation. The woman who went to sleep in the master bedroom that night had learned to trust herself instead, and the rewards were everything she had hoped they would be. The morning of my official reinstatement as co-founder and managing partner of Morrison Tech Solutions arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made Phoenix feel like the most beautiful city in the world. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a tailored charcoal suit paired with the diamond earrings my grandmother had left me, jewelry I had rarely worn during my years of playing the supporting role in David's success story. Today, I would be introducing myself to our employees as their co-leader, rather than their CEO's wife. Victoria had spent the weekend finalizing the legal documentation that would transform Morrison Tech from David's personal empire into our legitimate partnership. The papers were comprehensive and legally bulletproof, covering everything from governance structures to financial oversight to public representation of the company. More importantly, they included detailed provisions ensuring that my authority could never again be questioned or undermined. I arrived at the office early, using my newly upgraded access card to enter through the main entrance, rather than the side door I had traditionally used when visiting. The symbolic difference felt significant as I walked through the reception area where Amanda's desk sat conspicuously empty, her personal belongings apparently removed over the weekend while I was occupied with legal preparations. The first item on my agenda was a meeting with Robert Chen, our Chief Technology Officer, and the employee I trusted most to provide honest assessment of company operations. Robert had been with Morrison Tech for 15 years, rising through the ranks based on technical competence and unwavering integrity. If anyone would understand and support the changes we were implementing, it would be Robert. I found him in his office reviewing code specifications for a major client implementation, his desk covered with printouts and sticky notes in the organized chaos that characterized his work style. When I knocked on his doorframe, he looked up with the surprised expression of someone who hadn't expected to see me in the office during regular business hours. "Catherine," he said, rising from his chair with obvious uncertainty about the appropriate protocol for greeting his CEOs. "Wife in a professional setting. Is everything all right?" David mentioned there were some changes happening, but he wasn't specific about details. "Everything is going to be much better than all right," I replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Robert, I need to share some news about Morrison Tech's leadership structure, and I wanted you to hear it directly from me before the general announcement." I spent the next 30 minutes walking Robert through the essential facts of my partnership recognition, carefully avoiding the personal details that weren't relevant to business operations while emphasizing the legal and practical implications of our new governance structure. Robert listened with the focused attention he typically reserved for complex technical challenges, asking thoughtful questions about reporting relationships, decision-making authority, and strategic planning processes. His reaction was gratifyingly positive, marked by genuine enthusiasm for having someone with my operational knowledge involved in daily management decisions. "Catherine, if I'm being completely honest," he said when I finished explaining the situation, "this feels like something that should have happened years ago. You've been the person many of us turned to when we needed real answers about company policies or client relationships." His confirmation of my operational importance was validating, but it also revealed how much David had relied on my knowledge while simultaneously diminishing my contributions in public forums. We spent another 20 minutes discussing specific operational improvements that could be implemented immediately, from streamlined project management processes to better communication between sales and technical teams. When our meeting concluded, I felt confident that at least one senior manager would actively support the changes we were implementing. Robert's technical expertise and institutional knowledge would be crucial for maintaining operational stability, while we restructured other aspects of company governance. My next series of meetings with Patricia Gonzalez in client services and Marcus Williams in business development followed similar patterns. Both managers expressed enthusiasm for my expanded role and provided valuable insights about operational improvements that could be implemented immediately. Patricia identified communication gaps between technical development and client expectations that had created unnecessary crises. Marcus revealed that we had lost nearly $3 million in potential revenue due to inadequate proposal development capacity. These conversations confirmed what I had suspected for years. Morrison Tech's growth had been limited not by lack of vision or technical capability, but by inadequate attention to operational details that required sustained focus and systematic improvement. The afternoon brought my first official board meeting as recognized co-founder and managing partner of Morrison Tech Solutions. Our board was small, consisting of myself, David, Robert Chen, and 2 external advisors who provided industry expertise and fiduciary oversight. The meeting would serve as my formal introduction to governance responsibilities that I had been performing informally for years. David arrived at the conference room looking like someone who had spent the weekend contemplating the complete transformation of his professional identity. He was impeccably dressed and professionally composed, but I could see the strain in his expression as he prepared to acknowledge my equal authority in front of people who had always viewed him as the sole leader of Morrison Tech. The external board members, Sarah Hutchinson and James Morrison, were experienced technology executives who had agreed to serve as advisors during Morrison Tech's expansion phase. Both were aware that significant governance changes were being implemented, but neither had been briefed on the personal circumstances that precipitated these adjustments. "Before we begin today's agenda," David said, his voice carefully controlled, "I want to formally acknowledge Catherine's recognition as co-founder and managing partner of Morrison Tech Solutions. This change reflects her extensive contributions to company operations and formalizes a partnership that has existed since our incorporation. Sarah and James exchanged glances that suggested they were processing implications beyond the simple announcement David had provided. Both were sophisticated enough to recognize that such fundamental governance changes typically resulted from significant underlying issues. "Catherine," Sarah said, "congratulations on your formal recognition. Can you help us understand how this change will affect day-to-day operations and strategic decision-making?" I had prepared for this moment, carefully, wanting to project competence and authority while avoiding any suggestion that internal conflicts were affecting company stability. I outlined the operational improvements I had discussed with our senior managers, presenting them as natural evolution of company operations rather than corrections to previous management deficiencies. The board members listened with obvious interest, asking thoughtful questions about implementation timelines and expected business impact. When I presented the financial projections for improved proposal development capabilities, James reviewed the numbers and nodded approvingly. "This analysis demonstrates exactly the kind of operational insight that technology companies need to scale effectively," he said. "Many firms struggle because they focus exclusively on technical capabilities without developing proper business development infrastructure." The board discussion continued for 2 hours, covering everything from quarterly financial performance to strategic planning for the following year. Throughout the meeting, I demonstrated the depth of knowledge about Morrison Tech's operations that I had accumulated over 3 decades of informal involvement. David's contributions to the discussion were noticeably subdued, limited primarily to technical and strategic observations that didn't overlap with the operational areas I was now formally managing. The division of responsibilities was clear and appropriate, but I could see him struggling to adjust to sharing authority he had wielded exclusively for so many years. "Catherine," Sarah said as the meeting was concluding, "your operational expertise is clearly extensive. Have you considered pursuing additional board positions with other technology companies? Your combination of operational knowledge and strategic insight would be valuable for firms that are scaling their business development capabilities." The suggestion hadn't occurred to me, but it was flattering recognition from someone whose opinion I respected. After the board members left, David and I remained in the conference room to discuss implementation details for the operational changes we had approved. "The proposal development investment makes sense," David said, reviewing the financial projections one more time. "I should have approved this expansion months ago, when Marcus first raised the capacity issues." "Why didn't you?" I asked, genuinely curious about his decision-making process. "I was focused on maintaining margins rather than investing in growth infrastructure," he admitted. "Your operational perspective provides insights I've been missing." The board members recognized that immediately. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into implementing the operational improvements we had identified, working directly with department heads to develop streamlined processes and improved coordination systems. The changes were dramatic and immediate. Within 30 days, our proposal response rate increased from 60% to 85%. Client satisfaction scores improved across all service categories. Employee morale noticeably brightened as people found their work more coordinated and purposeful. More significantly, I began receiving recognition from industry contacts who had always known about my contributions, but could now acknowledge them publicly. At technology council meetings and professional conferences, I was introduced as co-founder, rather than spouse, leading to conversations about board opportunities and strategic consulting projects. The personal transformation was even more profound than the professional recognition. I moved through my days with confidence and energy I hadn't felt in decades, no longer hiding my competence or downplaying my achievements to accommodate someone else's comfort. The woman who had served champagne while her husband's pregnant mistress made announcements was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect through demonstrated capability rather than gracious accommodation. David and I settled into a working relationship characterized by professional respect and clear boundaries. We divided responsibilities logically, He focused on technical strategy and industry relationships while I managed operations and business development. The arrangement was more effective than our previous informal partnership had ever been, largely because it acknowledged reality rather than maintaining comfortable fictions. The divorce proceedings, when they eventually began, were handled with the same business-like efficiency that characterized our professional partnership. Victoria negotiated terms that protected my interests while allowing David to maintain his dignity and financial security. Amanda's pregnancy and their eventual marriage became footnotes in our story rather than central dramatic elements. 6 months after that devastating company anniversary party, I stood in the same Riverside Country Club ballroom hosting Morrison Tech's quarterly client appreciation event. This time, I was the one delivering the welcome address, speaking to a room full of clients and employees who knew me as their co-founder and managing partner, rather than the supportive spouse in the background. "Good evening, everyone," I began, looking out over the familiar faces that represented relationships I had helped build and maintain over 3 decades. "Welcome to Morrison Tech's Spring Client Celebration. I'm Catherine Morrison, co-founder and managing partner, and I want to thank you for your continued partnership in our shared success." The applause was warm and genuine, coming from people who understood that they were witnessing something significant. Many of these clients had worked with me for years in my unofficial capacity, and they appreciated finally seeing my contributions properly recognized. As I spoke about Morrison Tech's achievements and future plans, I caught sight of my reflection in the ballroom's mirrored walls. The woman looking back at me was poised, confident, and completely in command of her own story. She bore little resemblance to the person who had discovered her husband's betrayal in this same room just 6 months earlier. After the formal program concluded, I mingled with guests who offered congratulations on my official recognition and asked thoughtful questions about Morrison Tech's strategic direction. The conversations were substantive and respectful, marked by genuine interest in my perspectives rather than polite deference to my position as someone's wife. "Catherine," said Elena Rodriguez, the CEO of a successful software consulting firm, "I've been watching Morrison Tech's transformation over the past 6 months, and the operational improvements are remarkable. Your leadership is clearly making a significant difference." "Thank you, Elena. It's gratifying to finally be able to implement changes I've been thinking about for years. I hope you'll consider the board position we discussed. Our company could benefit tremendously from your operational expertise." I smiled, remembering how impossible such conversations would have seemed just months earlier. "Send me the details. I'm ready to expand my professional involvement beyond Morrison Tech." As the evening wound down, I found myself standing alone, on the terrace overlooking the golf course where David and I had once planned our future together. The view was the same, but everything else had changed in ways I could never have imagined when this crisis began. I thought about the woman I had been when Amanda made her pregnancy announcement in this very room. That woman had trusted completely, had subordinated her own interests entirely, had believed that supporting someone else's success was sufficient recognition for her contributions. She had been shocked by betrayal because she had never imagined that her loyalty and dedication could be taken for granted so completely. The woman standing on that terrace now understood that respect had to be earned through demonstration of value, that partnerships required mutual acknowledgement of contributions, and that personal fulfillment came from claiming credit for achievements rather than allowing others to diminish or ignore them. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless. Learning to advocate for myself after decades of accommodation required developing new skills and overcoming deeply ingrained habits. There were moments when I questioned whether the fight was worth the disruption it caused in every aspect of my life. But as I looked out over the lights of Phoenix stretching toward the horizon, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choices. The woman who had served champagne while her marriage crumbled had evolved into someone who commanded respect through competence rather than seeking approval through service. My phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. Saw the industry article about Morrison Tech's operational improvements. Congratulations on the recognition you've always deserved. I typed back, "Thank you for helping me claim what was rightfully mine." Another message appeared, this one from my sister Margaret. "Watched your speech online. Mom would be so proud to see you finally getting the credit for everything you've accomplished." The references to family reminded me that my transformation had affected more than just my professional identity. I had become a different sister, friend, and community member, someone who contributed actively rather than simply supporting others. Contributions. As I prepared to leave the country club, I took one last look around the ballroom where my old life had ended and my new life had begun. The space looked exactly the same, but I knew I would never again enter it as anything other than Catherine Morrison, co-founder and managing partner of Morrison Tech Solutions, a woman who had learned to value herself as much as she had always valued others. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where David and I had built our life together, past restaurants where we had celebrated business successes and landmarks that marked the geography of our shared history. Everything looked familiar, but I was seeing it all through the eyes of someone who had reclaimed her own narrative after decades of allowing others to write her story. When I arrived home, I found David in the living room reading a technology magazine. We had developed a comfortable routine of polite coexistence that worked well for both of us, characterized by mutual respect and clear boundaries, rather than the assumed intimacy that had marked our marriage. "How was the client event?" E. asked, looking up from his magazine. "Very successful. Good attendance, positive feedback about the operational improvements, and several new business opportunities identified. I saw the photos on the company's social media. You looked very comfortable in the leadership role." "I was comfortable. More comfortable than I've been in years, actually." David nodded, understanding the implications of my response. "Catherine, I want you to know that watching you claim your proper place in the company has been one of the few positive outcomes of this entire situation. I should have recognized your contributions years ago." Recognition was never really the issue, David. The issue was respect. You can recognize someone's contributions while still treating them as subordinate rather than equal. "I understand that now," he said quietly. "I'm glad you found the strength to demand better treatment." "I'm glad I finally understood that I deserved better treatment." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, two people who had shared a life together, but were now building separate futures based on mutual respect, rather than romantic partnership. "David," I said finally, "I've been offered several board positions with other technology companies. I'm planning to accept at least 2 of them, which will require some travel and additional time commitments. That's wonderful news. Your expertise would be valuable for other companies, and the board experience will benefit Morrison Tech as well. I wanted you to know that my expanding professional commitments don't represent any reduction in my dedication to Morrison Tech's success. If anything, the external perspective should help me identify additional improvement opportunities." "I have complete confidence in your professional judgment," he replied. "You've earned the right to make decisions about your career without consulting anyone else." The conversation represented everything our relationship had become: respectful, professional, and focused on mutual success rather than personal accommodation. It was healthier than our marriage had been in years, largely because it acknowledged reality rather than maintaining comfortable illusions. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed in the master bedroom that was now exclusively mine, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from betrayed wife to business leader in less than 6 months. The transformation had required courage I didn't know I possessed, intelligence I had never been allowed to fully demonstrate, and determination I had developed through years of quiet frustration. But most importantly, it had required learning to value myself as much as I had always valued others, to demand respect rather than simply hoping for appreciation, and to claim credit for achievements rather than allowing others to diminish or ignore my contributions. The woman who turned off the lights that night was someone I barely recognized from 6 months earlier, but she was also someone I was proud to have become. She was Catherine Morrison, co-founder and managing partner of Morrison Tech Solutions, board member of multiple technology companies, and someone who would never again allow herself to be invisible in her own life. The revolution was complete, and I was finally living the life I had always deserved, but had never known how to claim. Amanda's pregnancy announcement had been the catalyst for my transformation, but the strength to change had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. That moment had arrived, and I had seized it with both hands, reshaping not just my professional identity, but my entire understanding of what I deserved from life. As I drifted off to sleep, I smiled, thinking about tomorrow's challenges and opportunities. There would be board meetings to attend, operational improvements to implement, and new business relationships to develop. But most importantly, there would be the continued satisfaction of living authentically as the person I had always been, underneath the accommodating facade that had defined my marriage. The woman who had served champagne while her world crumbled was gone forever. In her place was someone who would never again apologize for her competence, never again hide her intelligence, and never again allow anyone to treat her as anything less than the equal partner she had always been. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.